On a frozen Tuesday morning, the Western Front stood on the precipice of a total collapse that would have prolonged the war by years. While his superiors braced for a humiliating retreat, one man wagered 250,000 lives on a promise that defied the laws of physics and logic. December 19, 1944. General George Patton faced Dwight Eisenhower and claimed he could do the impossible. How could a single commander pivot 250,000 men and 133,000 vehicles through a blizzard and save a besieged town in just 48 hours? The silence of the Ardennes in early December 1944 was a deceptive shroud that masked the impending doom of the Allied campaign in Europe. We had grown arrogant. Fueled by the rapid sprint across France and the intoxicating scent of a victory we thought was only weeks away. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's broad front strategy had stretched our lines to the breaking point, leaving the rugged forests of Belgium and Luxembourg guarded by a ghost front of exhausted veterans and untested green recruits. On the morning of December 16th, that silence was vaporized by the thunder of 2,000 German guns as Adolf Hitler launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, a final, desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and seize the vital port of Antwerp. As the German 6th Panzer Army and 5th Panzer Army tore through the American lines, the Allied High Command was paralyzed by a catastrophic knowledge gap, initially dismissing the massive offensive as a local spoiling attack. But in the war rooms of the Third Army, the reality was already being mapped out with chilling precision. For weeks, Patton's intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been presenting declassified National Archive reports and daily unit war diaries that highlighted a massive German buildup. While Schaff slept, Patton's G2 had identified the movement of the elite 6th Panzer Army into reserve positions, a detail Patton used to anticipate the strike that everyone else claimed was impossible. One common historical misconception that we must dismantle right now is the idea that Patton's legendary 90-degree pivot toward Bastogne was a spur-of-the-moment act of impulsive bravado. Archival evidence from the Third Army staff journals proves that Patton had ordered Brigadier General Halley Maddox to begin contingency planning for a northward strike as early as December 12th, 4 full days before the German shells began to fall. Patton was not just a firebrand, he was a meticulous operational architect who understood that in the friction of war, a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan next week. The strategic gravity of the entire campaign centered on a single geographic point, the Belgian town of Bastogne. 7 major roads converged there like the veins of a heart, and if the Germans could not secure this crossroads, their heavy Tiger and Panther tanks would be funneled into narrow, icy trails that would turn their blitzkrieg into a graveyard. Eisenhower, recognizing the danger, ordered the 101st Airborne Division to hold the town at all costs. The Screaming Eagles arrived in open-air cattle trucks, many of them lacking winter boots or adequate ammunition, digging their foxholes into the frozen earth just hours before the German ring closed. By December 19th, the situation was dire, and Eisenhower summoned his top commanders to a cold, damp barracks in Verdun for a crisis conference that would determine the fate of the war. The internal friction in that room was palpable, as General Omar Bradley and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery grappled with the scale of the breakthrough. Eisenhower opened the meeting with a grim mandate. He needed someone to strike the German southern flank and relieve the pressure on the Ardennes. He turned to Patton and asked the question that has since become military legend. "George, when can you attack?" The room went silent as Patton looked at his watch and replied with a gravelly authority that shocked every officer present. 3 divisions in 48 hours. Eisenhower's face reddened with irritation, warning Patton not to be impulsive or facile. He knew that moving over 250,000 men and 133,000 vehicles across 150 miles of icy, snow-clogged roads while disengaging from an active offensive in the Saar was considered logistically impossible by every metric of modern warfare. But Patton had already pulled the lever. He had left his chief of staff, Hobart Gay, with 3 specific code words, cent, nickel, and dime, to activate the move the moment he gave the signal. Imagine if Patton had played it safe and asked for the standard 6 days to reorganize. By the time the Third Army reached the Ardennes, the 101st Airborne would have been out of ammunition, the German 5th Panzer Army would have crossed the Meuse River, and the Allied line would have been severed. The catastrophic consequences would have included a second Dunkirk-style evacuation and a negotiated peace that left the Third Reich intact. Patton's gamble was not just for glory, it was a desperate race against a total strategic collapse. The logistical miracle that followed was a symphony of grease, steel, and American grit. As the 514th Quartermaster Group and the military police worked around the clock to guide massive armored columns through a blackout blizzard, Third Army tanks and trucks consumed 350,000 gallons of fuel every single day, and Patton's orders were clear. Gasoline was more precious than blood. He famously threatened to shoot any supply officer who brought him food instead of fuel, roaring that his men could eat their belts. While Patton's steel columns began their grueling march north, the defenders in Bastogne were entering a frozen hell. By December 21st, the town was completely surrounded, and the 101st Airborne's medical company had been captured, leaving the surgeons with nothing but cognac and basic bandages to treat the hundreds of wounded men shivering in the cellars. The German commander, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, sensed the end was near and sent a formal surrender ultimatum, threatening the total annihilation of the town by heavy artillery. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, was woken from a brief nap to receive the German emissaries. His initial reaction was not a prepared speech, but a single, visceral word of American slang that would echo through the centuries. "Nuts," he muttered, crumpling the paper. When his staff reminded him that he needed a formal reply, he decided that his first instinct was the most honest. The typed response, "To the German commander, nuts," was delivered to the baffled German officers, who had to have the idiom explained to them as the equivalent of "go to hell." The defiance of McAuliffe was mirrored by the aggression of Patton, who was often found in his open command jeep at the front of the 4th Armored Division's columns. He was a master of arousing morale, believing that 80% of an army commander's mission was to infuse his spirit into his men. He knew that fatigue makes cowards of us all, and he pushed his soldiers beyond the limits of human endurance, demanding they ignore the freezing cold and the German 88mm anti-tank guns that were picking off his lead Shermans in the narrow valleys. Facing Patton was the German 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger, a commander tasked with the impossible mission of screening the southern flank with understrength infantry divisions. Brandenberger's troops were a mix of Luftwaffe transfers and old men, many of whom were using horse-drawn wagons because they lacked the fuel to move their own trucks. The collision between Patton's high-velocity armored warfare and Brandenberger's desperate, dug-in defense at villages like Martelange and Chaumont turned the snowy landscape into a slaughterhouse of burning metal and broken dreams. As the blizzard of December 22nd intensified, grounding the Allied air forces and burying the roads in drifts of snow, Patton turned to a power higher than his own. He summoned his chief of chaplains, Colonel James O'Neill, and demanded a prayer for good weather. "I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as the Germans," Patton barked, ordering 250,000 copies of the prayer to be printed and distributed to every man in the Third Army. It was a moment of profound spiritual resolve, as 250,000 soldiers asked the Almighty for the fair weather for battle that would allow the 19th Tactical Air Command to return to the skies. The psychological friction between the commanders was reaching a boiling point. While Patton raced toward the crossroads, Field Marshal Montgomery was privately criticizing the American performance, leading to a bitter rivalry that nearly fractured the Allied coalition. Patton was determined to reach Bastogne before the British could claim the glory, driven by a personal belief that his destiny had pointed his entire life toward this singular moment of rescue. He compared the upcoming clash to the Battle of Gettysburg, knowing that the Bulge was the final hinge of the war. By the evening of December 23rd, the first part of the miracle occurred. The clouds broke and the sun rose over a frozen Ardennes, allowing the C-47 transport planes to drop over 1,400 tons of supplies to the starving paratroopers in Bastogne. The race was now in its final, most violent phase. Patton had kept his promise to Eisenhower, and as the 4th Armored Division prepared its final dash through Arsinois, the world held its breath to see if old blood and guts could truly break the German steel and save the screaming eagles before the clock ran out. The dawn of December 24th brought a clarity to the Ardennes that was as beautiful as it was lethal. The gray shroud of the last week evaporated, revealing a sky of brilliant, piercing blue. This was the moment Patton had prayed for, the moment when the immoderate rains ceased and the 19th Tactical Air Command could finally unchain its P-47 Thunderbolts, while the paratroopers in Bastogne watched the C-47 transport planes fill the air with hundreds of colored parachutes. General Patton was miles to the south, demanding that his commanders exploit this divine window of opportunity. He knew that the German 7th Army was brittle, a force of conscripts and Luftwaffe transfers holding the line with horse-drawn wagons, but they were dug into the quartzite rock pits of the Ardennes, and they would not leave without a bloodletting. Once the weather cleared, the relief of Bastogne was a foregone conclusion. In reality, the ground was a nightmare of frozen slush that turned every secondary road into a bowling alley of black ice, and the German defenders at villages like Chaumont and Martelange were using their PaK-40 anti-tank guns to turn American Shermans into pyres of burning steel. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the 30-year-old commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, was growing frustrated with the slow, methodical pace of the division's advance. He looked at the map and realized that a head-on collision with the German 5th Fallschirmjäger Division would only lead to a war of attrition they couldn't afford. Abrams made a decision that would redefine armored aggression. He suggested a bold, high-velocity dash through the village of Eisenhower, straight into the heart of the Bastogne perimeter. The technical precision of this breakthrough was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare, as Abrams coordinated a massive artillery barrage of 2,340 shells to rain down on German positions in Clochemont and Eisenhower. Under the cover of this thunderous curtain, the lead tank of the column, an M4A3E2 jumbo Sherman nicknamed Cobra King, began its historic charge. The jumbo was a specialized assault variant. Its frontal armor thickened to over 100 millimeters to resist the dreaded German 88 millimeter guns, and as it highballed through the village, its crew, led by First Lieutenant Charles Bulge, fired their 75 millimeter main gun as if it were a machine gun. They moved so fast that the German defenders were caught in their bunkers, unable to react before the steel beast was upon them. At exactly 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, Cobra King ground to a halt near a German pillbox just 2 miles from the Bastogne town center. Bulge spotted uniformed figures in the woods and, wary of German infiltrators masquerading as Americans, called out into the frozen silence. A man stepped forward, extended his hand, and simply said, "Glad to see you." It was Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Engineers, 101st Airborne. The handshake between the tanker and the paratrooper symbolized the end of the siege, but for Patton, the work was only half finished. He famously remarked that a man as eloquent as McAuliffe deserved to be saved, but the corridor into Bastogne was a narrow, fragile artery that the German High Command was determined to sever. The human cost of this relief was immediate and visceral, as the first convoy of 70 ambulances and 40 trucks braved the icy roads to enter Bastogne at 3 a.m. on December 27th. The conditions inside the town were a chamber of horrors, where nearly 1,000 casualties had been accumulating in frozen cellars without surgical supplies. Medical inspectors described the stench of gore and human excretions as they began the triage, working by the dim light of flashlights to select the 946 men who would be evacuated first. Patton's Third Army surgeons were flown in by glider to assist, but they found a division that, while battered, refused to admit it needed rescuing, a pride that persists in the 101st Airborne's lore to this day. But Hitler's bodyguards were coming. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, commanded by Wilhelm Mohnke, was ordered to launch a desperate counterattack to cut the Bastogne-Arlon road and trap Patton's spearhead. On December 30th, the elite SS Panzers smashed into the 35th Infantry Division at Loutrebois, coming within 400 yards of the vital highway. This was the internal friction of the campaign. Patton was pushing his men to the breaking point, demanding they hold them by the nose and kick them in the pants, while his subordinates grappled with the reality of fighting elite Panzer IVs in a blizzard. The Bulge was not just a line on a map. It was a living, breathing struggle of endurance where the army with the higher breaking point would win. while the men in the foxholes fought for survival. A different kind of war was raging in the High Command. On January 7, 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery held a press conference that would nearly shatter the Allied coalition. Montgomery, in his characteristic style, essentially claimed credit for saving the American armies and suggesting that he had tidied up the battlefield after the Americans had been badly slapped. Patton was livid, writing in his diary that Montgomery was a tired little fart whose caution had prevented the Allies from bagging the whole German army. This rivalry was not just professional, it was a clash of fundamental war-fighting philosophies between Montgomery's methodical preparation and Patton's relentless high-speed offense. Eisenhower, acting as the ultimate mediator, decided to use this rivalry to his advantage. He set a race to the town of Houffalize, a critical road junction 10 miles north of Bastogne, where the 1st and 3rd American armies were to link up and trap the German elite units. Patton launched the 11th Armored Division, the Thunderbolts, into a grueling march through snowdrifts that buried vehicles to their axles. The logistics friction was absolute. Tanks were consuming fuel at an alarming rate, and the 11th Armored was forced to navigate forest paths because the main roads were death traps. Patton's destiny was once again on the line as he aimed to reach Houffalize before Montgomery could claim another piece of the glory. On the morning of January 16, 1945, at exactly 9:05 a.m., the reconnaissance elements of the 11th Armored Division finally made contact with the 2nd Armored Division of the 1st Army in the ruins of Houffalize. The Bulge had been pinched, and the Great Trap was closed, though most of the German elite units had already slipped away through the narrow gaps. This moment marked the strategic end of Operation Wacht am Rhein. Hitler's last gamble had resulted in 120,000 German casualties and the depletion of reserves that could never be replaced, leaving the Eastern Front wide open for the oncoming Red Army. Imagine if the 101st Airborne had surrendered on December 22nd, without Bastogne as a dam in the German logistical flow. Manteuffel's panzers would have reached the Meuse in force. Eisenhower would have been forced to withdraw to the Seine, and the war in Europe might have dragged into 1946. Patton's promise at Verdun was the pivot point upon which the liberation of Europe turned. He understood that in war, fatigue breeds pessimism, and by maintaining a relentless tempo, he forced the German 7th Army into a state of tactical dissolution from which they never recovered. The myth we must dismantle is the idea that Patton was a cold, unfeeling commander who cared only for headlines. Archival letters to his wife Beatrice reveal a man who felt the weight of every casualty, once writing that it is foolish and wrong to mourn the men who died. Rather, we should thank God that such men lived. On January 14, 1945, Patton visited the 101st Airborne headquarters at the Chateau Rolle. In a small stone-walled room, he pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on General McAuliffe. It was a rare moment of humility for Patton, recognizing that his Third Army had only been able to achieve the impossible because the battered bastards of Bastogne had refused to break. The logistical data of this campaign is staggering. Over the course of the Bulge, Patton moved more than 250,000 men and managed a support operation that was feeding and clothing 7.5 million people by the spring. The Red Ball Express drivers, many of whom were African-American soldiers, performed a miracle of their own, hauling over 400,000 tons of supplies across 500 miles of hostile terrain. Patton's mastery was in the synchronization of these raw numbers with the human spirit, a philosophy that proved wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. As the last shells fell on Bastogne in late January, the Third Army began its drive toward the Rhine and the heart of the Reich. Patton had emerged from the Ardennes as the only senior Allied general with his reputation enhanced, having proven that his old blood and guts philosophy was not an anachronism, but the most effective tool for modern maneuver warfare. He had read the fingertips of the enemy and wagered everything on the belief that American soldiers, when led with conviction, could overcome any tactical surprise the Wehrmacht could muster. General George S. Patton would not live to see the first anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, dying in a car accident in December 1945. According to his wishes, he was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery in Ham. positioned at the head of his men who fell during the Ardennes campaign. He lies there today, a sentinel overlooking the ground, where he executed the greatest operational maneuver in military history. His legacy is not found in the ivory-handled pistols or the colorful profanity, but in the survival of the 18,000 men who held the crossroads because they knew Patton was coming. The Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest engagement for American forces in World War II, a vivid case study in leadership, resilience, and the sheer obstinacy of the human will. It proved that even in the darkest, most frozen hours of 1944, a single man's promise and an army's grit could save the Western Front from a catastrophic collapse. As we look back at the signpost in Bastogne, we are reminded that history is not made by the cautious, but by those who have the guts to do the impossible as of yesterday. The 101st Airborne famously claims they never needed rescuing, while history credits Patton with saving the town. Who do you think was the real hero of Bastogne? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.